makes a person evil? Is it hereditary? Is it predestined? A genetic mutation? You could get a million different answers when you fall down the rabbit hole of an evil mind. Upbringing definitely would play a factor in this story. Pattern of abuse, toxic environment, but not everyone in the household would go on to hold sick ideas and carry out horrendous deeds. Only one. Marcus Wesson was born on August 22, 1946 in Kansas, as the oldest of 4 children. Mother Carrie was deeply religious and raised him to be a member of her faith of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She was a religious fanatic according to Marcus, which would be quite an ironic statement coming from him. His father Benjamin was a drunk and would often beat the children. It is widely speculated that he may have sexually abused the kids as well, although this was never 100% proven. Marcus's sister said that Dad would be overly affectionate with the kids when he drank, which was quite a bit. It turns out that Benjamin was actually a homosexual. He would abandon the family and run away with his lover, who was also his cousin. As a child, Marcus was pretty quiet. He didn't get into a lot of trouble and he didn't have many friends. He enjoyed caring for animals and playing with electric trains. He was pretty big, and you would think his enormous size would make him an intimidating presence. It was quite the opposite, however. Marcus would be the one that was bullied. He was different, and he was weird, and he would dress funny. Instead of wearing the newest urban gear, he would wear dress pants and button-up shirts to school with a tie. He would get scoffed at and ridiculed. The other kids saw him as a punk. Marcus would spend a lot of time pretending to be a preacher. He would prepare sermons and read them to others. His mother brought him up in the Seventh-day teachings. Marcus saw how powerful religion could be. Look at how it affected his mother. She was heavily invested. Her whole life revolved around Seventh Day. Marcus would go on to use it as a tool. When he gave his sermons, all eyes would be on him. He would captivate his audience. They would hang on his every word, and he could make them believe anything he wanted them to. His mom wanted to move out to California, which they set out to do when Marcus was a teenager. They settled in San Bernardino. He would drop out of school because he really had no interest in it and no interest in graduating. He joined the army by the time he was 19 and served 2 years. Soon after, he met a woman in San Jose named Rosemary, who he ended up living with. Rosemary was older than Marcus and had 8 children of her own. They would end up having a son of their own in 1971, who they named Adair. Instead of stepping up to take care of his son, his attention went towards Rosemary's daughter Elizabeth. At only 8 years old, Elizabeth started to endure sexual abuse by Marcus. As time went on, the predator would continue to assault his victim. Marcus continued to rape Elizabeth until she eventually became pregnant at the age of 14. Marcus told Rosemary that he wanted to marry Elizabeth. Rosemary did not try to fight him on it. Even though Rosemary was not crazy about the idea, she told Elizabeth to go along with it. Elizabeth would have Marcus's first child 4 months after their homemade wedding ceremony. She would go on to have 9 more children by him. This would be Marcus's first of 6 marriages. The others would be the 2 daughters and 3 nieces. Marcus held a strong belief for polygamy. Rosemary, Marcus, and Elizabeth would live under the same roof for a while, until Marcus decided to relocate with Elizabeth. After they moved out, Marcus would end up being given more children to care for. Elizabeth's sister was battling drug addiction, and it was determined her children would be safe under Marcus's care. Ruby, Ortiz, Rosa, and Sofina would be the nieces that Marcus would end up marrying. He would have so many children by his wives, the group's total would be as high as 16. Marcus did not work because he was the head of the household and did not believe he should have to. He would make the girls work at fast food restaurants, and he would take all of their earnings for himself. He was also on welfare. If the girls did not have enough money to buy their own food, he would force them to dive in dumpsters for their dinner. But he himself would always have enough to eat. The group lived like nomads, never staying too long in the same spot. Neighbors thought their situation was odd, the way they lived like shut-ins, but they were not aware of how bad the situation actually was. Marcus had a couple of boats they would sometimes stay on that were in serious need of work. When the IRS learned that Marcus had not reported the boats as assets, Marcus would be arrested and charged with welfare fraud and perjury. In 1990, he would serve 3 months in prison. David Koresh was the leader of the Branch Davidian, a religious group that would mostly be described as a cult. His group was a sect that was an offshoot of Seventh-day Adventists. He became infamous through the 51-day siege in Waco, Texas in 1993 that would end in bloodshed, including his own. Marcus watched the standoff unfold on TV and would admire Koresh. He would warn his family to not trust the police or government. Marcus would tell them that someday the government would try to come and separate the family, and at that time the family would have to give themselves up to the Lord. This was their murder-suicide pact. Marcus, of course, did not plan on killing himself. He would have to live on to tell the children's story. Marcus had a fascination with vampires, and this would be incorporated into his religion. He would say Jesus must be a vampire because he was immortal like vampires are. He would say the only difference between him and a vampire was that vampires don't have a soul, but he does. That's debatable. Marcus would write his ideas in his homemade Bible, which he titled The Night of the Light for the Dark. The book contained passages about quote-unquote premium incest and how it is the right thing to do to show love. Polygamy was also a main theme of the vampire cult. Marcus would give his children vampire names. He would also give himself one. That would be a combination of Jesus, Marcus, and vampire. It was G. Marcus Spire. He would have his kids wear dark clothing and bright red lipstick because it was important to uphold vampire traditions. He would constantly tell his family that there was a second coming of Christ, and he predicted it by the year 2000. Sometime after Marcus had gotten out of jail for welfare fraud, he got a place on Hammond Avenue in Fresno, California. It was put under Elizabeth's name. Life in the Wesson household was filled with grim reality. Marcus was the Lord and Master, which his wives, daughters, and sons would bow down to without question or backtalk. The girls were to wash his dreadlocks and rub his armpits when he commanded them to. The sons were given far less attention. The boys were not needed for sexual gratification, so they were far less valuable than the girls. And because of this, Marcus would strongly encourage the boys to move out as soon as they were able to take care of themselves. But while they were staying under his roof, it was forbidden for the boys to speak with the girls. The girls were his property, and he'd be damned if these youngins were going to hone in and take what was rightfully his. If the boys talked to the girls, the penalty could be severe. There were many rules in the house, and the kids received regular beatings. Sometimes an aluminum bat could be used, wrapped in duct tape, or a cable wire used as a whip. One time, Marcus's son Serafino was caught sneaking a scoop of peanut butter when the kid was practically starving. Marcus punished him by beating him with a stick wrapped in duct tape 3 times a day for 30 straight days, and we are talking roughly 20 lashes at a time. And to add insult to extreme injury, it was Serafino's responsibility to remind Marcus to beat him every day. Education was non-existent in the Wesson household. Nobody under Marcus's care would go to school because Marcus would forbid it. He was supposed to be homeschooling, but all he did was quote scriptures from his vampire Bible to the kids, hours on end. Sometimes the kids would color, but they wouldn't be learning anything useful. Marcus would take his daughters and nieces innocent at the age of 8 or 9. He would teach them how to perform oral sex on him, explaining this is how you treat your husband. He was grooming the young females and planning on wedding them. He would supposedly wait until they were teenagers before he began having intercourse with them and getting them pregnant. When the baby was born, Marcus would discipline the infant if it got out of line. Niece/wife Safina had Marcus's child Jonathan. If Jonathan cried at all, Marcus would spank him and would not stop spanking him until the baby stopped crying. At 1 month old, the tiny infant would be whipped with a stick, and he would wind up bleeding from his legs. Safina decided to leave the household shortly after. She would find a different place to live. Marcus allowed her to leave at first, but when he learned she was having an intimate relationship with a co-worker of hers, he lost his mind. How could his niece/wife do this to him? He picked her up from work one day and stabbed her in the chest after she tearfully admitted to the affair. He told her she was going to die. She had to promise to come back home in order for him not to kill her. She returned to the house with him and sat there bleeding, wondering how she would be able to leave and how she could rescue her son. Regardless of the abuse, the kids of the household still loved their dad. This was the only parent they had ever known their whole life. They thought maybe he was a god. Marcus would straight up tell him that he was. Daughter Kiani, who had 2 children by him, declared that she loved her husband/father. She always looked forward to movie night each week with him and his other wives/daughters/nieces. They would also play a game where the kids would make funny faces, and it would usually put a smile on everyone's face, if only for a short while. Niece Rosa also loved her husband very much. It was tough for them to say anything bad about him, even though this was their parent who had raped and beat them since they were kids. Sabrina Wesson was arguably the most loyal of the bunch. She was another wife/daughter to Wesson. Marcus knew that he could depend on her if anything went down. If Child Protective Services or the government stepped in to separate the children, Sabrina could do her part and enforce the murder-suicide pact they had talked about dozens of times before. Sabrina despised the other wives who were leaving the house or disrespecting the king in any way, and she would call them out on it. By March 2004, the older boys had all moved out of the house on Hammond Avenue. The oldest boy in the house was 7. Ruby and Safina had escaped by then. Elizabeth had tried to escape too, but when Marcus found out, he choked her until she passed out. They were all starting to see through Marcus's bullshit to some extent. Ruby and Safina were planning on going back to get their children from Marcus. They had heard that Marcus was getting evicted from the house and taking all the kids to Washington, where Marcus's mother now lived. Ruby and Safina would go to the house at 761 Hammond Avenue that day. They had a terrible feeling that this was not going to go well. They had a hard enough time escaping from the house in Marcus. Marcus had actually allowed the ladies to leave, but on the condition that they leave their kids with him. Ruby's daughter Aviv and Sophie's son Jonathan had been left behind. On this day, they tried to get Marcus to hand over the kids. Marcus refused and a shouting match ensued. Marcus's wife and daughter Sabrina screamed at them from the house. Kiani, Rose, and Lise joined in against the desperate mothers, calling them traitors and whores. Sabrina commanded that they now bow down before their lord. Knowing this wasn't going to go anywhere, Ruby and Safina got the police involved and told them that their kids were being held captive. The ladies had brought the children's birth certificates with them. The father's name on the bottom was left blank. This was at Marcus's instruction, and now it had come back to bite him on the ass. He had no rights to the children. By this time, other family members had gathered outside, including a few of Marcus's older sons and matriarch Elizabeth. The once little 8-year-old girl was now in her mid-40s. She was livid at what was taking place. She screamed at the mothers that they should have been given a warning before coming in involving the police. Elizabeth was aware of what Marcus was capable of, and was terrified of what could happen. The police spoke to Marcus. Marcus remained calm and polite during the conversation, but he would say that he shouldn't have to give up the kids, that the kids had been given to him by the mothers. The police did not have a warrant, so they could not enter the home and remove the children. But if he did not allow the mothers to take the kids, they would be forced to call CPS. And if CPS came out, they would more than likely take all the kids. Marcus's worst fears were now becoming realized. The police and the government were at his door now, and they were trying to separate the kids from him. He thought back to David Koresh and the siege at Waco. He snapped back to reality. In a composed manner, he said that he would hand over the children, but he was just going to say goodbye first. He turned his back and went toward the house. Ruby and Sofina began to panic. They were aware of the way Marcus thought and knew about the murder-suicide pact. They screamed for the officers to go in the house, that he was going to hurt the kids. The officers said they didn't have a warrant, and there was nothing they could do. Marcus's son told the officers Marcus has a gun. Still, the officers did not budge. Shortly after, popping sounds could be heard. Police would later claim they didn't hear anything resembling gunshots. Wesson family members and neighbors would say they distinctly heard gunshots sound off. Elizabeth bravely ran towards the house. She went inside and didn't see anyone. It was so quiet a chill ran up her spine. She walked towards the back bedroom at the back of the house. Marcus had his arm around the back of their daughter Lisa's neck. Lise turned around and looked at Elizabeth with fright in her eyes. The look was of a person who had just seen something horrific, and of one who was facing certain death. Marcus turned around and yelled for Elizabeth to come here. Elizabeth froze for a second. Then fight or flight kicked in. She would turn and run like hell out the front door. She would be haunted for years for running out on her daughter and allowing her to die, but she knew if she stayed they would both be dead. After Marcus had been in the house for almost an hour and a half, he came out and surrendered. Police could tell from his clothing that blood had been shed, but they did not know the extent and severity of it. Police entered and walked past a dozen coffins that were littered throughout the front room. The coffins had been purchased for the kids months earlier. The police would come upon body after body piled on top of each other in the back bedroom. They would not know how many until hours later, but would find out it was 9 in all. This would include 2 adults and 7 children. Of the 7 children, 3 were under the age of 2. All 9 were under the age of 25. The children were all shot through the eye at close range with a .22 caliber pistol. The gun was found next to Sabrina, and Marcus would say that she was the one who shot all the children before turning the gun on herself. It very well might have been true. Gunshot residue was found on Sabrina, but not on Marcus. Sabrina was said to have been infatuated with guns and death. She would say that she couldn't wait to die, and she was Marcus's most loyal soldier. But could she have it in her to actually murder these poor children, these babies? One of the babies was hers, 18-month-old Marcy, an infant. How deprived can one be? And for what? Because Marcus said it would be better for them to be in heaven than to be separated on earth? Maybe Sabrina believed that her and the others would go to heaven, but the big guy is said to frown upon murder and suicide. I think part of Marcus's motives could have been his pride. Marcus warned them that all this would happen. Now Ruby and Sofina were testing him. He had to follow through and make good on his threat. Also, it has been theorized that he shot the kids because they were living proof that he committed incest and the rape of minors. He got spooked when the kids would be put into CPS. They might talk, but the problem with this theory is even if they're dead, DNA can still link him to them. So that idea wouldn't have made much sense. I'm not sure if Marcus had considered this. But the fact that he would kill all the children and not himself shows how narcissistic he is. And it shows that he thinks he can actually get away with this. He's trying to pin the whole thing on his daughter, who would sacrifice everything for him. He's just going to throw her under the bus and separate himself from her in the act completely. Marcus Wesson is basically like every other cult-leading demon. They do what they want to make themselves feel good, albeit power, control, and sexual gratification, and fuck all else. Chief of Police Jerry Dyer would say this was one of the most gruesome sights he has ever come across, and many officers that were there that day would have to take a leave of absence to seek extensive counseling. Marcus Wesson was charged with 9 counts of murder and 14 counts of rape and oral copulation on a child. As stated earlier, gun residue was found on Sabrina and not Marcus. The defense tried to use that to their advantage. It didn't matter to the jury, though. The guy was guilty even if he didn't pull the trigger. Charles Manson didn't pull the trigger or wield a knife. Wesson was ultimately found guilty on all charges on June 17, 2005, and sentenced to death. He sits on death row in San Quentin prison, and unfortunately he seems to be enjoying himself there. He is still writing in his vampire Bible. He is writing country western songs. I don't think he has any remorse for the despicable cowardly acts he undertook on March 12, 2004. This guy was and is such a monster. His children never had a chance. I honestly think that Marcus's old girlfriend Rosemary should have gone to jail as well. She allowed her 14-year-old to marry and get impregnated by Marcus, and she probably knew about the abuse beforehand. Rosemary would actually go on to defend Marcus at his trial and talk about how loving he was. She would say things like, "I don't know why God decided that the kids needed to die that day. God didn't decide that, you dummy. Your psycho ex-boyfriend did that you pimped your child out to." But anyway, I'm swinging at air right now. Rosemary Mitorina Solorio died in San Jose on August 27th, 2011, 2 days before her 78th birthday. She was the Ghislaine Maxwell of this story. As far as Elizabeth goes, it's still important to remember she was victimized since she was 8 years old by this demon. Marcus was supposed to be a father figure to her, and he ended up grooming her and ruining her childhood and adulthood. Yes, she was aware of what Marcus was doing. I have no doubt about that. She walked in on Marcus receiving a fellatio by one of her children on at least one occasion. She was abused for years, and I think she might have felt like she was a prisoner, like all the other kids, even after coming into adulthood. She would deny that she knew anything was going on between Marcus and the children, because denial was the easiest way to go. She felt it pointless to try to explain the impossible situation to people. Nobody could understand unless they have lived through it themselves, and she is still having to deal with this bullshit today. While in prison, Marcus was actually able to claim her stimulus check. That is some crazy shit. My heart and prayers go out to all the survivors of this madman. Elizabeth, Sofina, Ruby, Kiani, Serafino, Gypsy, Rosa, Julian, Dorian, Alme, and any other survivors. They have all had to go through extensive counseling for what they have gone through and for what transpired on March 12, 2004. Most of them would once defend their father, even after he committed the murders, saying he was the best dad anybody could ever have. But now they can see how wrong he was about everything he did. They were born into this hellish life with Wesson, and they had no basis for comparison. This was normal life for them. They were sheltered from the outside world. To put it simply, they didn't know any better. They now describe Wesson as mentally defective, delusional, and psychotic, and I think we can all agree on that. These are the names of the victims that perished. May they rest in peace. Marcus is the father to them and grandfather to some of the younger ones. Sabrina Wesson, 25, Mother Elizabeth. Lise Wesson, 17, Mother Elizabeth. Illabelle Wesson, 8, Mother Kiani. Aviv Wesson, 7, Mother Ruby Ortiz. Jonathan Wesson, 7, Mother Safina. Ethan Wesson, 4, Mother Rosa Solorio. Marcy, 1, Mother Sabrina Wesson. Jeva, 1. Sedona, 1.